For hundreds of years, the priest-kings continued to rule Nehekhara, but the corruption of Nagash had forever tainted the land, and it was never truly recovered. The individual city rulers had exhausted their populace in overthrowing Nagash, and they now had to contend with famines, civil wars, and marauding barbarians from distant lands. The treachery of Nagash had also tarnished the authority of the royal lines, and it was not until several centuries later that order was commenced once again.
Alcadizaar was the eldest son of King Artan Heru, priest-king of Khemri. The Queen of Resetra and wife of Artan Heru had a troubled pregnancy, and fearing the death of her first child, the queen desperately came to the city of Lamia and begged for her child's life at the Temple of Blood. There, Neferata gave the woman an infusion containing her blood, and when the boy was born, claimed him as her own, saying he would stay in Lamia until he came of age and took his throne in Khemri. This child would be called Alcadizaar. Neferata grew to believe that Alcadizaar would become her latest partner, and had him trained in every aspect of war and statehood. Given a positively unnatural life by Neferata's blood, Alcadizaar stayed within Lamia for many decades, postponing his rights to the throne of Khemri in hopes of achieving greater glory and prosperity for his kingdom, should he promise to marry Neferata and join the two cities in holy union. By his 50th year, Alcadizaar, who was still as young, vigorous and handsome as he was in the prime of his youth, finished his indoctrination and was tricked into drinking from the elixir of life, thus becoming a vampire. Disgusted by his own queen's treachery, Alcadizaar managed to escape her grasp when Ubayd, his former mentor, sacrificed himself to give him time to escape. When he escaped, Neferata chased her former lover and future husband, and partial son, surely, because she's given him some of her blood, and it's had some kind of effect, and partial son throughout the streets of her own city, her true features revealed for what they truly were. Yet Alcadizaar knew this city well and managed to hide himself within a large ceremonial urn located at the storage room of a local potter, there shaking with horror at the revelation that he had witnessed. After a day, the prince learned to hide himself within the city's masses, avoiding the minions of his monstrous stepmother and her incestuous ways. For nearly 8 months, Alcadizaar, Prince of Resetra and would-be King of Khemri, lived like a harbour rat among Lamia's busy docks. He looted and he stole, gambled on games of dice, and drank sour beer in reeking alehouses that no city guardsman dared enter. He killed his first man in a vicious back-alley brawl when a gang of sailors tried to press-gang him onto their ship. For a time he worked as hired muscle for one of the most notorious brothels in the Red Silk district, and there fell into the company of a gang of jewel thieves who preyed upon the old noble families who lived in the shadow of the royal palace. That association had ended in blood and betrayal on a moonless night in early spring. Alcadizaar had escaped with nothing more than a handful of copper coins and a dying woman's kiss. She had been his first love, and she had nearly been the death of him. Finally, the prince judged that his time had come. He was certain that Neferata was still looking for him, but her attention was still fixed on the caravans and the travellers' quarter. The guards at the city gates had slipped back to their daily routine, and his description had changed from the night of his escape. He was much thinner now, and his features were hidden beneath a full black beard. Dressed in faded desert robes and laden with a leather pack filled with food, spare clothing and other supplies, he passed through the eastern gate, in the middle of a torrential afternoon rainstorm. The guardsman, scowling from the doorway of the gatehouse, waved him through without so much as a second glance. But the prince soon learned that escaping the city was only the first of many challenges that lay between him and distant Resetra. Beyond the watch forts at the eastern end of the plain, The land was wild and lawless, infested with roving gangs of outlaws that preyed on unwary travellers. His hopes of falling in with an eastbound caravan were quickly dashed, as the paranoid merchants and their hired guards feared that he might be a spy for the caravan raiders. Alone and on foot, Alcadizaar's skills were tested to the utmost over the first few months as he struggled his way across the plain. He was forced to fight for his life on more than one occasion, but his training and the lasting potency of Neferata's elixir saw him through. The road became less dangerous, but no less hard, once he had left the Golden Plain behind. Alcadizaar made his way to Liberas, thinking that Resetra's ancient allies would lend him aid, but the prince found the city of scholars in a sad and decrepit state. The famous collegiums were all but deserted, and the palace of Scholar Kings was closed even to its citizens. Alcadizaar lingered there for almost a month, waiting in vain for an audience with King Pachet, but the royal viziers refused to even listen to him. He left Liberas as road-weary and penniless as he'd been when he'd arrived. Finally, almost a full year and a half after his escape from the Temple of Blood, Alcadizaar passed through the formidable gates of Resetra, the warlike city of his people. The prince was pleased to see that the city prospered under the rule of his younger brother Asar. This time he knew better than to approach the palace directly. He was sure that Lamia had agents in the city, and they were certain to be on the lookout for him. Instead, he made inquiries in the market, and that evening he found his way to the home of his uncle Kenti. Although Kenti was an old man now, his strength gone and his vision fading, he recognised Alcadizaar at once. The prince was welcomed with tears of joy. Later, when he had told Kenti of what he'd seen inside the temple, his uncle wasted no time in arranging a secret meeting with Asar inside the palace. Accompanied by Kenti, Alcadizaar was ushered into the king's privy council chamber, where he met his younger brother for the very first time. Though Asar did not possess his brother's extraordinary physique and magnetic charisma, the kinship between the two could not be denied. Asar welcomed his brother warmly, and over goblets of strong southern wine, Alcadizaar told Asar his horrifying tale. This was the moment that the prince had been waiting months for. Sitting in the filth of Lamia's back alleys, he'd envisioned his brother's face lighting up with righteous rage as he learned of Neferata's crimes. Swift messengers would be sent across the length and breadth of the land, spreading the news and summoning armies to war. Alcadizaar would return to the City of Dawn as a conqueror, at the head of a vast army made up of warriors from every city in Necromancy. But Alcadizaar was to be disappointed. The king of Resetra listened to his prince's tale, his expression thoughtful. When Alcadizaar was finished, Asar took a long sip of wine, and then gave his brother a frank stare. Asar had made it clear that he believed every word of the prince's story, and vowed to send agents to uncover proof of Neferata's crimes. But Alcadizaar knew that such efforts were doomed from the start. No stranger to the city could stand a chance of penetrating the palace compound and slipping undetected into the temple, and none of the temple's high priestesses could be persuaded to betray their mistress's secrets. That left only one possible alternative. If the great cities needed proof of Lamia's hidden evil, then Alcadizaar would have to obtain it himself. He had remained as his uncle's guest for many months, formulating his plans, and then he slipped quietly from the city amid the guards of a merchant caravan bound for Liberas. 6 months later he found himself, once again, friendless and alone upon the lawless expanse of the Golden Plain. Alcadizaar had thought that slipping back to Lamia would have been a simple matter. It had been years since the escape. For all that the rest of the world knew, he might as well have been dead. In fact, that was probably the most likely occurrence. But Neferata still hadn't given up looking for him. If anything, her search had turned far darker and more terrible than before. The city docks and the poorer districts lay under a constant pall of dread. The streets were all but deserted after dark, because people were disappearing almost every night and were never seen again. Informers were everywhere, searching for men who matched his description. The city guard had tried to detain him at the west gate, when no amount of gold would dissuade them. He'd then been forced to draw his sword and fight his way out. Mounted riders had scoured the trade road for weeks afterwards, searching for him. He'd only managed to escape by fleeing deep into abandoned farmland, where the bandits held sway. There he fell in with a tribe of bandits for 20 years. His unnatural lifespan increased further by the elixir of life. Throughout the 20 years that Alcadizaar spent with the desert nomads, he learned much of their lifestyle and began to rise in the ranks of their society. His natural talent for command and his high levels of education and specifically military skill were a great boon to him. And of course the special abilities that were given to him by the elixir of life and the blood of Neferata. In a society where the education and rearing of noblemen can make them gods amongst men almost, this combined with the magical abilities of a vampire will certainly do the trick for upward mobility. Once Alcadizaar managed to gain enough influence in the desert tribes, he began to use this to uncover Neferata's coven. Couriers and courtiers were captured and taken by the desert tribes, and soon the secret of Lamia was revealed. Alcadizaar took proof of the meddlings of the Queen of Lamia, and also proof of his lineage as the eldest son of King Aten-Heru, a priest king of Khemri previously, and laid claim to the throne of Nehekhara itself. Emerging out of the wilds, this supernatural king at the head of his barbarian army, a people that had not been subjugated since Setra himself was on the throne of Khemri, was a striking and symbolic sight for many of his subjects, and many of them supported his claim without quarrel. And as Alcadizaar addressed those that did quarrel with his claim to the throne in the quick war of succession that followed, the very metaphysical power of his countenance on the battlefield, this ancient king who was 50 years of age by the time he escaped from Lamia, remaining to be, at least in appearance, in the prime of his life, and seemingly of supernatural physical ability, even surviving huge gashes as he threw himself with an unnatural courage born of the knowledge of his immortality into the front lines of a battle, crushing the skulls of his enemies in his hands with an inhuman strength and ferocity, did a lot for his negotiating skills, certainly for the soldiers of the princes that would be facing him. It did not take long at all for them to capitulate to his armies. So then, it was not long until Alcadizaar ascended to the rule of Khemri and Nehekhara as a whole. Under his wise and charismatic leadership, Alcadizaar bound the great cities under his rule, and Nehekhara began to prosper once again. The treachery of Nagash was still hanging over the land, and it was hard to forget. Since his reign of terror, the mortuary cult had been watched very closely. The lich priests were forbidden from deviating from their age-old lore of incantations, which had remained unchanged for centuries before Nagash. However, the lords of the city of Lamia hungered for power over their rivals, and they had seen in Nagash's sorcery the means not only to dominate all of Nehekhara, but also the chance to live forever and to sever their dependence on the mortuary cult. To this end, they had stolen one of the blasphemous books of Nagash from the Black Pyramid, and over the course of centuries they had secretly become adept practitioners of necromancy. The Queen of Lamia, Neferata, embraced the malign magic and used her powers to consort with demonic entities. She created a tainted version of Nagash's elixir, extending her life indefinitely, yet cursing herself for all eternity. This is the elixir that she had given to Alcadizaar forcefully, after tricking him into it. Not possessing the skill or knowledge of Nagash, Neferata and her courtiers were struck by an unquenchable thirst for mortal blood. Lamia had become the birthplace of the vampires, fell creatures whose individual strength and unholy power were greater than that of a dozen men. Fearful that necromancy would bring about the wrath of the gods, and hungry for his final revenge, King Alcadizaar made war on the tainted vampire queen. Alcadizaar gathered legions from every other Nehikaran city and forged them into a single massed army that he led against Lamia. Thousands of chariots raced across the land ahead of vast regiments of archers, mighty phalanxes of spearmen and battalions of giant war statues. Against such a host, not even the accursed vampires could prevail. The power of Lamia was smashed. The Pale Queen fled, accompanied by those she had embraced into her hellish vampiric existence. I say, you can find out the servants of death by their marks. No man is born so unnatural that his body does not revolt at the foul pollution of undead blood. And by these marks you can tell them, by the fangs of the predator. For their thirst for blood is like that of a foul beast. By their porcelain white skin, cold to the touch and unnatural to the eye. The glow of their eyes, behind which lives the terrible hunger. These are the marks of the blackest evil. These are the marks of the vampire. Unbeknownst to the vampires, they had been guided by the implacable will of Nagash since their creation. Residing far away in his fortress, Nagashizar, amid the mountains to the north of Nehikara, the arch-necromancer recognized the spawn of his own ancient evil and was gladdened by the corruption of Lamia. Here were worthy champions, their damnation a tribute to his dark genius. Drawing them to him, Nagash welcomed the vampires and they became his dark captains. Through them, Nagash began a new offensive against Nehikara, and the two sides fought numerous battles, the outcomes of which would pave the way for the necromancer's inevitable return. Beside the vampires came the dead warriors of a vast host, skeletons drawn from the knights and cairns of the northern lands by the power of Nagash's sorcery. Nagash resurrected his trusted servant, Arkan the Black, who won many victories in his master's name. War assailed Nehikara for years on end, and the land was irredeemably scarred. However, Alcadizaar was the greatest general of his age, and he led a unified army of Nehikara against Nagash's evil for all their long years of battle. Under his leadership, the living legions of Nehikara never yielded, and finally, during the Battle of the Golden Skull, the undead hordes of Nagash were repulsed from Nehikara. The vampires scattered throughout the world to escape destruction, and without their magic and leadership, their armies of skeletons crumbled. Nagash had been defeated. There was much rejoicing throughout Nehikara, though the evil sorcerer himself still walked the land. It had been no coincidence that the vampires came across Nagash. Through his agent, Wasoran, Nagash had manipulated them from the first and lent them his magical aid from a distance during the siege of Lamia. When Neferata learned the full extent of Wasoran's manipulation, she was furious, even more so when Nagash passed her over to offer his distant relative Vashanesh a position as leader of his forces. Nagash had crafted a ring that would allow the vampire who wore it to return from the dead even more easily than they already were able to. But through the ring, Nagash could control all of vampire kind. Vash-Nesh had accepted the ring, and at Nagash's command, the vampires led his army to Khemri. Although at first the vampires were eager to serve as Nagash's lieutenants to gain revenge on Alcadizaar and regain Lamia, it became apparent that their survival was irrelevant to Nagash. He hurled them carelessly against the enemy, as he would his mindless undead troops, and he cared not for rebuilding Lamia and sought instead to destroy all of Nehekhara. Bound by the power of the ring Vash-Nesh wore, they were unable to disobey Nagash or even his second-in-command Arkan. Vash-Nesh hit on an ingenious solution to the problem, however. Suspecting the control Nagash exerted relied on a living vampire wearing the ring, and believing the great necromancer's assurance it would return him from the grave, Vash-Nesh allowed Alcadizaar to cut him down at the height of a battle. The vampires were freed from their control, and only Wasoran remained. The others scattered to the winds after bickering over where to go and who deserved to lead them. Mad-Messis and Har-Kethe vanished out of history, although there were rumours of vampires in Far Cathay and the Southlands who may be of their lost bloodlines. Ushuran settled in Strigos. Neferata travelled widely, influencing the nations of man from their foundings, and inserting her daughters in privileged positions amongst them. Wasoran stayed by Nagash's side whilst he cursed and ranted at the fickleness of vampires. Upon Nagash's defeat, Wasoran took many of his master's writings and studied them with the aid of his acolytes and his apprentice Melchior, transcribing his notes in the dread grimoire Necronium. His mastery of necromancy grew so profoundly that he was able to limit the red thirst that drove vampires to live dangerously close to mankind, although the effect of this change was to hideously twist his line's physical form. His reward for the feat was death at Melchior's hand. Vash-Nesh eventually returned, as Nagash had promised that he would, and he spent the next few centuries testing the limits of his ring. Even if Nagash had truly died after being abandoned by the vampires, which seemed unlikely, the ring had allowed Arkan to control them as well. Vash-Nesh set out mastering certain magical arts to make the ring his slave rather than vice versa. During this time, he'd spent much of his time in the lands of Kislev, where he took up the name of Vladimir. Almost unnoticed through the annals of history, Vash-Nesh travelled to the land of Sylvania that he had first seen as a soldier in the Legion of Setep, and calling himself Prince Vladimir, he aided Varnal in crafting an undead host to defeat the Skaven who threatened the land in the wake of the Black Death. Content with this change he had wrought in history, he returned to hiding for another 700 years. When he came back, it was under the name Vladimir von Karstein. Back in the war-torn land of Nehekhara, Nagash reeled from his defeat at the hands of Alcadizaar and his loyalists. Such was Nagash's bitterness, and so great the potency of his thwarted ambition, that he chose to end all life in Nehekhara rather than see anyone else hold power over the land. He polluted the great Vitae River, poisoning it until it turned thick and dark, tainting the lands that relied on its life-bringing waters. Forever after, it was known as the Great Mortis River. Pestilence and disease ran rampant across the great land. Within a few weeks, those who had succumbed to the terrible plagues outnumbered the living. The city streets were choked with corpses as fully 9/10 of the Nehekharan population perished. Mourning for his lost people, Alcadizaar sat upon his throne as his kingdom was destroyed. For all his skill at arms, he was powerless. Nagash's undead forces marched upon Khemri, brushing aside the city's plague-ravaged guard with impunity, and walking past the fortress walls and siege barracks unchallenged. His skeleton warriors broke into Khemri's royal palace and dragged Alcadizaar away to rot in a dungeon cell. For the first time in centuries, Nagash sat upon the throne of Khemri, and the immortal King Alcadizaar would rot for eternity in the dungeons beneath Nagashizar. However, Nagash did not linger in Khemri for long. Filled with insane visions of power, he returned to his fortress and began to cast the greatest and most terrifying spell ever conceived. He intended to enact the Great Ritual, a spell powerful enough to resurrect every corpse across the globe and bind them under his control. With them, Nagash would command an unstoppable army of the dead that he would use to conquer the entire world. To power his great ritual, he consumed vast quantities of warpstone and summoned all the energy stored within his cursed Black Pyramid. As Nagash chanted within his fortress, the sky began to darken for hundreds of miles around, and the ground shook. As his spell reached its crescendo, a great wave of power surged from the sorcerer's body, washing over the lands of Nehekara and stealing the life from everything in its path. Crops shriveled, and animals perished within seconds. The last people of Nehekara fell to the ground, many of them the nomadic tribes that Alcadizaar had built his power base from, their skin withering as they aged a century in the blink of an eye. Within minutes there was not a single living creature in the entirety of Nehekara. Such was Nagash's execration of Alcadizaar, who had thwarted his plans for so long that he spared the imprisoned king to witness the horrifying fate that had befallen his former kingdom. Whilst the great ritual scoured the land of life, some things remained undetected far beneath Nagashizar. While Nagash was channeling his great spell, drunk with magical power and lost in dreams of triumph, Alcadizaar, the last king of Nehekara, was mysteriously freed from his prison below Nagashizar by a group of hunched, heavily cloaked, rat-like creatures. A powerful blade, made of the purest warpstone, was pushed into his hands, gripping the hilt of the weapon. Alcadizaar was guided by an unknown force as he wandered into the throne room of Nagash with the dreaded Fellblade in hand. With the dust clouds of a titanic undead horde coming nearer by the hour, the king knew that he needed to end all of this now. With faltering steps, the king approached, hesitating before the towering figure. Aided by a malevolent mental urging, the king struck. At the last moment, Nagash raised a claw to ward off the blow. The Fellblade was far too powerful to ward, though, and clove through Nagash's spell, cleaving the Necromancer's upraised fist. In retaliation, the great Necromancer snapped out of his stupor to unleash a heavy, deadly blast at the king. It was an epic struggle to behold, as the king of the dead and the king of the living fought for dominance of the mortal world. With his last bit of strength, the king once more drove on, and struck once more upon the necromancer's decaying body. The king went mad with vengeance, hacking at Nagash with every bit of strength he still possessed, until his sword's deadly enchantments took hold. Soon the deadly blade smashed through the iron-hard bones of the Lich Lord, and finally it laid shattered in 1,000 pieces, and the threat to the world was over. With his death, Alcadizaar staggered away, as the king looked once more across his once beautiful land. His land and his people were no more, and the king wept at the sight, despair washing over the fire within his heart. He aimlessly tried to walk back to his homeland, as the Fellblade took more and more of his life and soul away. The king walked, his body and soul being eaten and drained, until he finally fell upon the river Mortis. There the king died, and the legendary hero's body was never seen again. And so came the end of Alcadizaar, the unsung hero of the mortal world.